Today, I've been reflecting on the interplay between intensity and volume. Now, I've always been someone who enjoys pushing myself hard, whether that's in the gym, with work commitments, with running. I always like to go all out, quite high intensity. And I generally function at my best when I pair that with adequate recovery. And I've started to notice recently that I've been feeling a little bit flat, a little bit demotivated, and I haven't been recovering as much as I usually would, or at least to my usual baseline. And I was reflecting on what I'm doing differently and how that's impacting how I perform. And it got me thinking about how pushing hard requires an element of built-in rest in order to keep pushing hard. And you can't simultaneously push intensity and volume. Now, I learned this first lesson during my running days, but also recently during my powerlifting. Often you'll find powerlifters will train 4 times a week, maybe 5 at a push, and they'll train super hard, real intense, max effort. And to get strong at powerlifting, you need volume and intensity. So you need close to your rep maxes, or at least 80% thresholds, and then you need to train often, or at least get a lot of volume in. So in an ideal world, powerlifters would train 7 days a week, super hard. But most realize, if not all realize, it's a recipe for disaster. You will get injured, you will burn out, you can't keep pushing that max intensity. On the flip side, you will get runners. I was a middle distance runner myself for 10 years, so I'm very familiar with that lifestyle, and they generally train every day. They're doing 10-mile runs almost every day, especially the long distance runners, but the difference is their intensity is a lot lower. They're not maxing out. They might have 2 sessions a week, which are higher intensity stuff, but most of it is low intensity. So you've often got to choose between intensity and volume. And recently, if I look at what I've been doing, is I've been trying to push things intensely. I've been doing powerlifting, I've been doing a lot of work commitments, I've been doing this 30-day challenge, I've been taking on more load, and then I've also been doing paddle 4 times a week recently on top of my usual powerlifting, which has left me to be struggling to recover. And this is showing me that I'm probably trying to do too much volume whilst also trying to keep intensity high. And it's a pattern I can fall back into. When I was younger, I could definitely handle more, which leads to my second realization that your physical and mental stress, they draw from the same bucket. And when you're younger, that bucket's often bigger. I know myself when I was in my 20s, I could do a lot. I could physically push myself. I could go out drinking. I could barely sleep. And I would still somehow be able to keep going without burning out. It's almost like you have a buffer for taking on more stress. But as you get into your 30s, let's call it, or even late 20s, and just being a kind of normal person who recovers at a somewhat normal rate, you realize that physical stress and mental stress both drain you. So for me, for example, I might do 3 hours of deep work, which drains my brain and creativity and thinking. I've got coaching calls and other work commitments. All of that's just mental stress. Then I've got my physical stress, which is powerlifting and now paddle alongside that. They're drawn from the same energy reserve on some level. Obviously not directly, because one we're using muscles, one we're using the brain, but you'll find in terms of stress taken on, when mental stress is high, you can't take on as much physical stress. And same reverse. So when you're pushing yourself really hard, you don't have the mental capacity sometimes to do as much deep work. Most world-class athletes aren't solving complex mental problems, and most of the world's best thinkers aren't doing 1 rep maxes in the gym every day. All right, there's a element of so much you can do, so much you can push yourself. So my kind of lesson is trying to learn how far I can push things, but also perfecting in recovery. So I think I had a very good equilibrium for a long time of pushing my powerlifting super hard, doing my mental work, and then having recovery days. I had 3 days where I did very little, or at least 2 full rest days. Maybe I did 1 cardio day, but now I kind of do something on all my days. And even my Sunday, which was my full rest day, I've started doing a 10-kilometer run or a 15-kilometer run. So just for myself, I'm realizing that we can't push intensity and volume. Something's got to give. And for me, my thing that gave was my lower back, and also that way I'm feeling. I feel a bit more burnt out because I've been taking on too much. And yeah, this video today is more of a reminders to myself. I was checking in with myself in my walk thinking, why don't I feel as much energy as usual? What's different? And I quickly started to link this together, too much volume and too much intensity. And it got me thinking of the kind of third realization I had, that recovery is active and it's not passive. By that, I mean you've got to put intentionality into recovery. So right now, I don't really have recovery days in terms of physically. Mentally, I have a Sunday where I don't strain myself mentally, but physically, I do stuff almost every day. So I've got my 4 gym sessions, at least if I'm training with my lower back. I've had a few days off most recently, but generally 4 gym days. And then a friend messaged me for paddle, I'm in. Paddle tournament, I'm in. And I've thrown all that extra on top. And without realizing it, I've made the mistake, which I know is a mistake, of trying to match intensity and also volume. All right? So it got me thinking about life in general. We can work in intense sprints. Sprint, go all out, full effort. If you factor in recovery after, that's a good model, a model like I like. Or you can go slow and steady. You can do the marathon approach where you do a little bit each day and you're constantly building that up. And different things, like different approaches work for different mindsets. I've got friends who like to go in the gym every day. But me personally, I like to, most of the time, be in an intense season where I'm doing things intensely, but I'm also factoring in recovery. And I just need to be careful, and other people who are listening to this, hopefully you can relate to what season you're currently in. If you are pushing intensity, you need to be careful not to over push volume. If you're doing volume, which means you're doing something every day or most days of the week, you realize you can't push the intensity. It got me thinking of some friends who've gotten to running recently, and they were doing a long run on a Sunday. And if you don't know much about running and you go for a run with a group, you generally will run too fast. That's kind of been my takeaway. Everyone kind of pushes the pace a little bit and they're really going for it. Not thinking that in most terms, that Sunday run in that context is meant to be very easy. You're meant to be able to talk whilst you're doing it. You're meant to finish that run and go, that was nice, cool, done. And it's a kind of a recovery run, getting miles in. But without realizing it, you can very quickly push intensity too far, and all of a sudden, recovery just completely goes out the window. You end up burnt out, you end up maybe injured, but you can't sustain it. And this is the thing. And for me, I'm quite resilient to this. I've got quite a good buffer. So I did around 6 weeks of powerlifting 4 times a week and paddle 3 to 4 times a week, sometimes 5, fine. Could handle it. My powerlifting wasn't affected. I was like, this is awesome. I can do 2 things I enjoy doing simultaneously. But then slowly, I started to feel fatigue kicking in during my powerlifting. Then I started to get some lower back stiffness. And then lo and behold, one day my lower back decided enough's enough. And then since then, I've been struggling to get back to that baseline because I overdid it. And now the body's telling me, Adam, you're not Superman. You can't recover from doing everything. So I think it's just a reminder to myself and hopefully to you listening, decide what season you're in. If you're in an intense season, awesome. Make sure you factor recovery into that. That's mental and physical. All right, you need to have both recovery for both of those. If on your off days from mental work, you run a 15-kilometer run and at pace, or you do a heavy lifting session, you might be pushing things further than you think you are. So factoring in physical and mental recovery. And then if you're in a more of a volume phase where you're sustainably keeping in the volume, be careful how much intensity you add to that. All right. So for example, I could power lift intensely 4 times a week, or I could probably play paddle every day. But if I do the both together, now I've got intensity mixed with volume. And the same for your mental work. If you're taking on too much mentally every day and you're not recovering from that, and then you throw some high physical activity on top of that, where you're pushing that as well, very quickly things can break. So my lesson to myself is pick between the two, intensity or volume. You're not Superman. You need to recover and make sure you don't try to combine the both at the same time.